The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, just before we get started, I want to wish all of our listeners around the world who are celebrating the Lunar New Year a happy Year of the Dragon. For those of you who are not familiar with what's going on, this is the beginning of a 2-week odyssey in much of Asia. The largest human migration every year takes place at this time of year as people go home to see their families in Vietnam, China, Japan, Korea. And so just want to wish everybody a good start to the holiday. Let's talk about trade and investment, Cobus, because this is also the time of year when the Chinese government releases its preliminary trade figures for the previous year. So we get this batch of data from the General Administration of Customs in January, and then we get a more refined batch of data sometime around the second quarter where they break it down on a country-by-country basis. But what we got for the aggregate number was very, very interesting. And let me read you some of the data, Cobus, and I'd like to get your take on what this all means. So $5.9 trillion of total trade between China and the world last year. That was down 5%. In fact, many of the trading relationships that China has with different regions around the world were in the red. So there were negatives all across the board. Let's take a look at some of the major trading powers with some of the G7 areas. European Union trade was at $783 billion, down 7.1%. The U.S. came in at $664 billion, down almost 12%. And Japan was at $318 billion, also down double digits at 10%. Now, Cobus, for our purposes, given that we focus on the Global South, let's take a look at some of the regions in the developing world. ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia remain China's top regional trading partner at $911 billion. Yet even that region, which is so vitally important to China, fell by 5% last year compared to the previous year. Now, while China's trade volumes with most of the world, as I've mentioned, were in the red, there were some bright spots. And Africa was one of the bright spots. Total trade with the continent came in at $282 billion, up just 1.5%, so effectively flat. Now, that has to be considered a win, given the fact that overall trade was down. And let's take a look at how that broke down. So of the $282 billion, $172 billion worth of goods were sold from China to the 54 African countries, and the Chinese bought $109 billion worth of goods, mostly from the extractive sector. Latin America was another bright spot, with trade edging up 1.1% to $489 billion, closing in on the $500 billion mark. Brazil alone, by the way, accounted for more than a third of that total for the entire region, and Australia and Russia were also on the winning side of the ledger, both registering very strong gains last year. Cobus, what do these numbers tell you about China's trading relationship with different parts of the world?
It's all very interesting. I mean, one has to be careful not to overread them, but it sounds like, some of the numbers kind of give one a somewhat coded portrait of 2023, I think, kind of in the sense that, for example, I think the trade numbers with Russia is basically a little portrait of how Western sanctions against Russia didn't work or were undermined, or people found different kind of circle ways around them. And I guess what's also an interesting kind of data point is, on the one hand, everywhere is down, kind of except a few places, as you mentioned. And it's this kind of like interesting kind of indicator of how a recession in China or like a, kind of like different, like harder economic times in China impacts the rest of the world. It reminds me of that old cliche of like, if China sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. It does have that kind of effect where it has knock-on effects. Clearly also in the global north, ongoing kind of pressure on trade with China and probably also a certain amount of friendshoring, is maybe responsible for some of the falls in trade that we saw with Europe, with Japan, and with the US. And then two things in relation to the global south. One is that similarly, Southeast Asia has fallen and is a similar kind of, also has a cold, I think, but at the same time, it remains central to China's global trade. And then it's also finally, it's very interesting in relation to Africa to see the strength of the extractive sector, and particularly, I would guess, probably critical minerals, kind of playing a particularly kind of large role, in all of that. Overall, the fact that Africa came out slightly on the positive side was a pleasant surprise for me.
It's always interesting to me that they don't include the Persian Gulf in these first sets of data that comes out. And that would have been interesting as well to show how energy purchases have moved from Africa to Qatar, the UAE, Iran, and of course, Saudi Arabia. So we don't have that data as well. Sometimes they fold the Persian Gulf into what they call as Asia. That's Western Asia. So we're not really sure. But I think your point about the Russian sanctions is very interesting. Trade with Russia went up 26%, more than any other region in the world. Most of that is energy and to some extent food as well. So some wheat was coming in from Russia on that. Now, those are only about trade figures. Let's shift our conversation now to investments. Sometimes people get those two confused when they see the monetary flows go between China and the rest of the world. We're also seeing the emergence of what people are calling the small is beautiful trend. That's something that we started talking about more than a year ago. Just before we dive into some of the investment patterns around the world, can you give everybody a very quick refresher on what the Chinese call small and beautiful, small is beautiful, whatever they want to call it, but you get small, beautiful, what is it?
So this is a new trend, like a year or 2 years old kind of trend coming out of China, focusing on the fact that recipient countries are increasingly finding it hard to absorb more debt, and Chinese lenders are finding it hard to extend more debt. So they're focusing on smaller projects with smaller budgets and shorter repayment windows. So originally when the concept was mooted, the number people were raising was around $50 million. I think it's not a hard and fast kind of limit, but it does tend to favor projects, under 100 million, roughly. But what I think is important, it's not only about size or repayment, windows. What the smallest beautiful approach is increasingly also focusing on overlaps with what this report that you interviewed the authors today in new infrastructure. So, new infrastructure essentially is different kinds of high tech, kind of green energy, EVs, fintech, different kinds of kind of technology adjacent or technology centralized kind of applications that still play in the field of infrastructure. So it's less road systems or rail systems and closer towards data centers, ICT networks, green energy installations, and so on. But the point where I'm trying to kind of make the connection is that these tend to fall within the small and beautiful range. And they also tend to favor Chinese private sector companies rather than the traditional Belt and Road behemoths of the Chinese state-owned contractors that tended to drive the first phase of large-scale infrastructure. So this is, when we talk small is beautiful, it specifically means budget sizes, but it has this kind of additional meaning of overlapping with this kind of new technology and private sector areas that China is particularly kind of focusing on internationally at the moment.
Yeah, putting shape to what small is beautiful has been something that's been a little bit of a challenge. It's been a little bit nebulous up until now. But that report that you referenced that I spoke with one of the authors today about, New Infrastructure, Emerging Trends in Chinese Foreign Direct Investment in Latin America and the Caribbean, was written by the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. 3 authors worked on it, Margaret Myers, Angel Melguizo, and Yifang Wang. And what they did was so fascinating is that they showed that in Latin America, Chinese investment overall is down, but not gone. And this is really important. So as you pointed out, in the small is beautiful world, they're focusing on what they call new infrastructure. Those are those emerging technologies, those emerging trends that you mentioned, Cobus, in the realms of energy, communications, critical resources. Interestingly, those are the same areas that are also the priority for the Japanese, for the Americans, and for the Europeans as well. So that's where some of the great power competition is coming into effect. Let's take a listen now to my discussion with Margaret Myers, who is also the Latin American Asia Director at the Inter-American Dialogue, about the report that she co-authored on new infrastructure and Chinese FDI patterns in Latin America. Margaret Myers, welcome back to the show. Great to have you on the program again.
Thanks so much, Eric. Great to be here.
Let's talk about this report that you and your colleagues put together on what you're calling new infrastructure investments from the Chinese in Latin America and the Caribbean. Before we get into the details, why don't you just give us the headline in terms of overall investment trends in the region, what you've seen, in recent years, and how it compares to previous eras in Chinese engagement in the area?
Absolutely. So, what's quite interesting is that in the minds of most folks, right, we're seeing sort of an explosion in Chinese investment, not only in Latin America, but across the globe. And I think many of the headlines suggest as much. But when you really look at the numbers, in the Latin American context, at least, what we're seeing is, if not a total decline, right, in Chinese investment, something of a tapering across the board in the amount of investment, whether in mergers and acquisitions or in greenfield, in various sectors in Latin America. And this has been really quite evident over the past 5 years. That said, there is significant investment, Chinese investment, that's accumulated over time. From around 2003 to 2022, Chinese FDI totaled about 188 billion in Latin America and the Caribbean alone, which is still well below, U.S. or European FDI flows during the same period, and was especially low in 2022, just last year, in comparison to other countries. But what we've seen is that Chinese companies are growing their presence in the region as they pursue really quite targeted opportunities in nearly all Latin American nations. This is something we're seeing across the board. And we call these targeted opportunities or targeted sectors or industries new infrastructure, which is a term that China itself has used to describe them.
And before we get into the new infrastructure part, that's very interesting. I just want to get our terms right, because I think a lot of people aren't always very clear on what constitute a Chinese investment and who it's from, because they will see funds flowing from the policy banks or from other stakeholders, and those may be loans, but they're not necessarily investments. Can you define what is an investment and who are the players that we're talking about here?
Absolutely. And it's an absolutely critical question. Often you see, these numbers conflated in reports. And so it's important to distinguish between financial flows and then investment flows. We've spoken about this before, that China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank have been responsible for giving state loans across the region in previous years for major infrastructure projects in the many billions in certain cases, depending upon the countries, the recipients that we're talking about. This report is not about big loans from Chinese banks for major infrastructure. It's about Chinese state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises, but also private companies investing in the region, either through greenfield investments, so building new things, right? Acquisitions, which is a very big part of what China does in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in many cases, also joint ventures. There is also a lot of Chinese construction projects, in Latin America and the Caribbean, as there are across the world, where, Chinese companies will come in through a concession and build a project, but then leave. We're not talking about that here in this particular report. Every investment that we're documenting has some sort of ownership component to it. So China is there and has some sort of equity investment in the assets that it is either acquiring or investing in through other mechanisms. So it really is quite important to distinguish between the loans on the one hand and investments on the other.
Yeah, and I think that's very confusing for a lot of people, because they'll hear about some of the big road constructions, hospitals, that big infrastructure project. Those were mostly done through loans. Those are not investment. So what you're talking about, again, is equity stakes, mergers and acquisitions, a lot of what we would see American companies or Western companies that have done for decades in the Americas. And now the Chinese, have they been active in that space for a long time, or is investment a relatively new phenomena for the Chinese in the LAC?
China's been active in this space. And indeed, our report dates back to 2002. And back then, there were not nearly as many investments as we've seen, in more recent years. But there's been an interest in investing in sectors of strategic importance for whatever reason, right, to China for many, many years now, for a couple of decades. And, in the early years, the sectors or the projects of interest were largely focused on China's own food and energy security considerations, right? So we saw a lot of investment in agricultural related projects right across the supply chain in agriculture and logistics, for example, in processing and transport of food, also in energy assets, right? In addition to the major loans, oil-backed loans that were given to certain countries in the region, Venezuela and Ecuador, for example, we saw some actual investments, right, in oil fields, acquisitions of oil and gas companies. So this has been a feature, investment has been a feature of Chinese engagement with the region, economic engagement with the region for many, many years. But it has changed over time, right? Consistent with China's shifting interests and own shifting economic realities. And indeed, that's what we're seeing now in what I would call a sort of new phase of Chinese investment.
Let's go into the new phase. What are those new priorities that you talk about in the context of new infrastructure? Let's dive into the different categories that you found in your research.
So, China has been far more intensely focused, and this we see in the trade realm too, right? It's not exclusive to Chinese investment, but much more focused on industries that it views as sort of directly related to or aligned with its own development-related objectives. That is, its ability to grow at least moderate rates in the coming years. And the focus has been on broadly innovation-related sectors, right? Those sectors that will help China to upgrade economically and to be able to compete with those countries that have at this point become high-income countries, right, that have avoided what's called the middle income trap, which is something that China has been very preoccupied with for a number of years now. And so investment, in these innovation-related sectors is something that China deems most critical. In several policy documents of late, we've seen reference to the term new infrastructure, right, as comprising these various innovation-related sectors that China ought to be prioritizing, China and its companies, right? And these term new infrastructure is sort of broadly defined. You see different definitions even in formal publications or government publications. But there was a Shanghai newspaper, the paper.cn, right, that encouraged its readers very recently to play what it called an alphabet game to help recall sort of what the priority new infrastructure sectors are. And I thought this was an interesting and perhaps helpful way for all of us to remember what precisely, China may be prioritizing at home and globally looking ahead. And so they said, A is for artificial intelligence, B is for blockchain, C is for cloud computing, D was big data, E, new energy, renewable energy, right? And then F for unmanned factories. So there's an AI component to this as well, of course. And then G for 5G, H for ultra high voltage transmission as opposed to just transmission related investment, which we see a lot of in Latin America. And then I for industrial internet. So really, really high value add innovation related sectors that China is looking to compete in far more extensively and to be in many cases dominant in certain parts of the world. For Latin America, we don't see activity in every single one of these, A through I industries. We see more in some than others. And so for our particular report, we focused on electric vehicles manufacturing, which is, also a very big part of this. Other high-end manufacturing, which we're seeing, far more extensively in some countries than other, with Mexico factoring very prominently in that equation. Urban infrastructure, right? That's rail, other urban transport, and of course the ultra high voltage transmission lines that China referenced. And then in addition, obviously, to these areas, China's new infrastructure technology is also being exported to Latin America and the Caribbean and also built by Chinese companies. As we said, there's a lot of construction related activity, right? Though without a China ownership component. So there's a big drive, a big push, even a market seeking, right, push for more activity in these industries across the board.
I love that mnemonic device of the alphabet. That's super helpful, but it's also a little bit confusing because now we've got that mnemonic device, we've got new infrastructure, and then we've got small and beautiful. Some people call it small but smart. We've heard small or beautiful. You get the point there. How does small and beautiful new infrastructure and the A through I mnemonic device, how do those all fit together?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. It's something we grappled with when we were writing this project as well. What I think all of these, terms have in common is that they are born of a reflection on what has happened in the past in terms of, investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, especially in large-scale infrastructure projects, and a real understanding that a lot of what China has been doing over the past, decade or so, some of it's done very well for China and for the companies involved. In other cases, China has run into major obstacles, has had, a lot of challenges on the ground, and has, in some cases had to cancel or sort of delay projects, which has led to really costly problems for many Chinese companies, and indeed some problems in terms of, perceptions of the Belt and Road, broadly speaking. So how does one reconcile, right, those experiences and yet still try to engage effectively through the BRI in ways that will be supportive of China's economic growth and broader development-related objectives? Well, one way is to engage with these sectors, but also to engage in projects that in general are smaller, will guarantee a more effective and, guaranteed return on investment, right? That will not, provoke a local level response, whether from an environmental or social perspective, that, in many cases can be done in partnership with other international companies, potentially, or with local companies through joint ventures, just projects that, and this is where I think small but beautiful, or small but smart, and smart, this sort of shower may, right, comes into play. There are sectors of priority, but they also happen to be sectors in which the deals are smaller and will presumably, or theoretically at least, right, have a smaller overall footprint and impact. Whether that turns out to be the case or not, right, in aggregate is another question, and I think we'll see the effects of all of this in the coming years, but that does seem to be conceptually what China is aiming for at this particular juncture.
And what you guys found in your research was that both the number of the deals for these smaller projects and the value of them have actually been going up, even as overall investment has been going down. Did I understand that correctly?
Right. And that's one of the really interesting takeaways. So China's not leaving the region at all, right? And so we don't want to look at the sort of downward trend or else tapering in investment and say that China is exiting the Latin American and Caribbean region. It isn't by any means. The downward trend, I think, is due to wide-ranging factors, right? The pandemic is one of them. China's own economic challenges are another. The region's own economic challenges are another. But it's also because we're seeing investment in smaller overall projects, in terms of their value. And so it's going to look like less, but in fact, the number of projects has, in some cases, either sustained, depending upon the industry we're talking about, or increased. And so there is much more pronounced activity in a much more focused set of sectors or industries.
I'll be honest with you, when your report came out, I was actually a little bit surprised at some of the findings, only because some of the headlines that we've been covering quite closely is that Brazil now surpassed the United States as China's largest supplier of both corn and soybean. And it's always kind of fit into this mantra that China is a capital-rich, resource-poor country, and Latin America and the Caribbean are capital-poor, resource-rich countries. And so that was always a match that was really made in heaven. And we see now with the new trade figures for 2023 that came out, the Americas came in at $489 billion for the year, a small increase over last year. One of the only regions in the world, by the way, that did increase. And 37% of that was in Brazil alone. So I guess my question is, how much of this new infrastructure investment that you're talking about is heavily concentrated in the ABCs, that is Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and how much of it is spread across to the Caribbean, Central America, and some of the smaller countries as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question and observation. I would say, when we were looking at things have changed, and we try and document this as well in our report, and that, the countries of focus, in addition to the industries have shifted somewhat in recent years as China sort of thinks about how to mitigate risk or to engage more extensively in some of these sectors. And it's much more easy to do so given some of the conditions at present, for example, in Mexico or Brazil, that are facilitating of high-end manufacturing investment, right? Where there's a labor force that is already equipped with some of the skills to be able to engage in some of these investments and to carry out certain projects. In the past, so much of the investment and finance, frankly, was focused on Brazil, on Argentina, Chile too, right? Also Mexico. These factored to a degree depending upon the sectors that we're talking about. Now, I would say, and it really does depend on the industry, investment is far more dispersed. If we're talking new infrastructure, especially ICT, you really see ICT, that includes, all kinds, that's financial services, right? It can be equipment sales, it can be, broad telecommunications infrastructure development in much of the region. But, in Central America, it's much more focused on equipment sales. And then in, other parts of the region, in Chile, for example, or Argentina, you see much more of a focus on financial services, on, for example, fintech, right? On e-commerce, on cloud computing, on a lot of the more extensive projects that Huawei and others are looking to promote at the moment. So really everywhere, but with some diversification depending upon the industry. If we're talking manufacturing, though, really, as I said, it's focused on those places where there's already a degree of preparedness to accept these sorts of projects and already a degree of, for example, manufacturing sector agglomeration. Chinese companies have certainly taken advantage of, investment opportunities in Mexico for the same reason that many other companies have decided to nearshore of late and are looking to, just as many others are, access the North American market by investing in specific parts of Mexico where, much of this infrastructure, much of the labor force is already in place. And, in many cases are surpassing investment from traditional investors in car manufacturing and other sectors that have been major drivers of economic development in those particular regions. Brazil, obviously, and then Argentina to a degree have factored also in the manufacturing investment of late. But really, it does kind of depend, even within this sort of new infrastructure landscape, right? It depends on which type of new infrastructure we're talking about.
Well, I guess that's you brought up the question of cars, and you brought up Mexico, which is one of the concerns on Capitol Hill, is that the Chinese are going to use northern Mexico as a backdoor into the U.S. market to sidestep the 20% tariff that exists now on imported Chinese vehicles to the U.S. And so does your research incorporate the surge of BYD investment in, say, Brazil or coming into Mexico, and not just BYD, but other EV manufacturers? Does that count as part of this trend of new infrastructure investment?
It does. And that's a very big part of it. And we actually saw a pretty significant growth in EV type investment, right? Just in 2022. That, of course, incorporated not just manufacturing of the car as a whole, but of the components of, electric vehicles. And there are many that China is very specialized in manufacturing. And so what that captures is maybe not necessarily a proliferation of car development in Mexico for exportation to the US, but instead, China operating as it has in the past as a provider of intermediate manufacturers to those companies that actually manufacture these vehicles, whether they be electric vehicles or not. So much of what China is interestingly doing in the context of Mexico is not necessarily EV related. They've been working on cars that are the development of cars and also components for cars that are not, specifically for electric vehicles. It's a bit different in Brazil. There's much more of a focus on that. But what we see to date, is much more of an effort, and this may shift over time, and it will be something for everyone to sort of take a look at, is much more of a focus still on providing components. And a lot of that is driven by nearshoring activity by some of the major car manufacturers, for example, Tesla. And so when Tesla went to Mexico, so many of its, of its original, or those providers that were working for it, originally followed suit. And so we saw a real surge in investment following that particular decision to shift operations to Mexico, at least in part. And we're seeing that in other cases too. What's interesting about Mexico is that a lot of these companies are coming in through shelter companies. That includes state-owned enterprises, but also private companies. And that means that these, shelter companies help them to adapt to the environment. They help them to navigate USMCA to ensure that they're producing enough content in Mexico for it to be able to be used, in higher-end manufacturers there, but also to be potentially exported to the United States. At the same time, though, if they're coming in through shelter companies, this information, this data is not incorporated in official statistics about Chinese investment in Mexico. And so the assumption is that, what we have in the way of numbers on Mexico is grossly underestimated. And in fact, China's presence in Mexico is far more extensive than we realize.
And just very quickly before we go, because I know time is running short, just on this question of the United States, the data and the findings that you have found seem to put China more in direct competition with the kinds of investments that American companies do, particularly in new energy, technology, services, less in the big infrastructure projects that the Americans weren't really that competitive with. Now, when you talked about this report to folks in DC, they were already anxious about China's growing presence in Latin America. And when you bring these new findings to them, what's been the reaction among U.S. stakeholders?
Yeah, I think there's a deep concern about the extent of this activity and a real sense that, that it's growing at a rate that was perhaps not anticipated, in part because so much of the policy, right, China's industrial policy is pushing for more in the way of engagement in these sectors, and indeed they're being prioritized and supported in ways that others are not. And so there are tremendous anxieties. These are the sectors, the areas that the U.S. has prioritized in its various initiatives in the region. Not just that, but Global Gateway 2 in Europe, right, has set out to prioritize, for example, electric vehicles and other sectors that directly overlapped with China's conceptualization, right, of new infrastructure. And so you see across the board a lot of competing interests and some considerable overlap in the priority sectors that all of these actors have identified. Whether U.S. companies can compete or not is going to require some very creative thinking and policymaking on the part of those in DC and elsewhere, because obviously Chinese companies are coming to the region, not always, but in many cases with a lot of tools in hand, and in many cases, access to fairly low interest financing, and really substantial and extensive networks in place, and in some cases, right, already a proof of concept in place, having been engaged for so long in, for example, ICT and telecommunications and some of these other sectors of interest. So they're very well established. So competition will be all that more difficult looking ahead.
The report is New Infrastructure, Emerging Trends in Chinese Foreign Direct Investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's absolutely essential reading, even if you're not interested in the Americas. If you read this report, you'll start to get a better understanding of what smart and beautiful, small but smart, new infrastructure, all of the terms that you want to put onto it, you'll start to see what it's taking shape and what it looks like. It was written by Angel Melguizo, Yifang Wang, and Margaret Myers, who is the Asia and Latin America Director at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington. Margaret, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. As always, it's such a pleasure.
Cobus, it is always enlightening for me to have the chance to speak with Margaret. She's been a good friend of the show over the years and always provides a very interesting perspective that challenges a lot of the narratives that we see in especially the U.S. and European discourse about the health of the Belt and Road. We've seen a lot of stories over the past year that the BRI is maybe not dead, but meager and falling away, and it's not a priority as what it was. And I think this report shows that it's evolving more than dying. Again, one of the key findings in the report that I brought up in the conversation with Margaret, which I thought was so interesting, is that while the total amount of FDI is down, And that's again measured against these boom time years back in the mid 2010s when they were building huge energy projects, big infrastructure projects. They're not doing that anymore. But when you look at the number of deals and the value in these new infrastructure sectors, it's up. And that's the area that I think we have to focus on when we talk about the Belt and Road. Forget about the big SGRs in Kenya, the big ports in Peru. That's from a bygone era. Our focus now should only be in this so-called new infrastructure.
Yes, I mean, things may well change again, but that seems to be the pattern at the moment, is that this new infrastructure field is providing a lot of the kind of projects that China that are now characterizing China's new version of the Belt and Road. And at the same time, I think it looks like, over the time as we've been talking about these kind of pivots in the Belt and Road, occasionally we came to this kind of metaphor where we said that the COVID shutdown in China acted as kind of as a stage curtain, kind of that was closed for a while and people were changing the stage set around behind the curtain, and then at some stage the curtain opened. And I think that moment when the curtain opened was really during the Belt and Road Forum late last year, where China really was like, ta-da, kind of like big new engagements everywhere, essentially. But all of those engagements had been tailored and tweaked and changed and, kind of to reflect a new set of priorities, not only a set of political and development priorities, but also I think a set of development priorities and trade and investment priorities. And I think this report, I think, is really fascinating reading in providing insights into what these new priorities are. It's even within the ICT field, for example, a shift away from providing components towards providing services, or towards investing in new, again, financial technology sectors and so on. There's, even within the field itself, there's all of these shifts away from certain things towards other things. And that's happening in numerous fields at the same time. So, so one gets the feeling that all of this, that the kind of new phase of the BRI coincides with new thinking or a new phase in Chinese international investment and trade with the global south as well. So it's a lot more complicated than it seems, I think, and this report really gives a fantastic glimpse of that.
Now, the next milestone that I think we're going to get about this new Belt and Road, the new infrastructure priorities, the shifting priorities, as you've talked about, is going to be the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Gathering that will take place later this year in Beijing. We don't know exactly when. They always keep this a mystery about the specific day, sometimes right up until the week of. I don't know why the Chinese do this, but it's really annoying. But nonetheless, we know it's going to happen this year. Cobus, you have been looking at the priorities for the Chinese and the priorities for Africans in a pair of reports that are going to come out later this year, maybe in a month or two. Tell us about the new priorities from an African perspective as you see it in this new era.
I think the priorities from Africa's side overlap quite effectively with some of the smallest beautiful obsession in China at the moment. And I think this research in Latin America provides quite a robust kind of glimpse of similar things that I think are going to emerge in Africa as well.
Yeah, I was just about to say this should be required reading for everybody going into FOCAC so they know what the standards and expectations are. Yeah, I thought so too.
Exactly. Because we're already seeing very similar trends, I think, in the Africa-China space, and I think the kind of demand that is partially driving all of this interest in China in some of these fields like green energy, like ICT and related ones, are even stronger. That demand is even stronger in Africa than it is in Latin America. So what I expect, or some of the areas where I see demand from Africa overlapping with supply in China is particularly, as we mentioned, green energy. And I think these may well be big national or urban projects, but also possibly small and possibly also rural projects. This is the thing about these projects, they're kind of scalable up and down. They can shrink and grow as one needs to, which is different from older style BRI projects like rail, for example. And then, so green energy is one, ICT and data network building and provision, and then also ICT sector investment is another one. And then I think where it is a little bit different than in Latin America is the particular focus on agriculture. So I think both Latin America and Africa will have strong agricultural relationships with China, but I think the African one will be more developmentally focused, more jobs creation focused, and it's a little bit lower tech. It was interesting. One of the details in this report was that there's the strong focus in Latin America is particularly towards things like fertilizers and different kinds of agri-tech kind of applications. And I think those are going to be strong in Africa too, but with that, there'll be a stronger dose of Africa-specific kind of agricultural attention, which I think will particularly center around trying to increase the number of African products moving into the Chinese market, which of course Latin America is already very big on.
Indeed. The report came out also at around the same time when U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was wrapping up his four-nation Africa tour. He ended the tour in Angola, and that is symbolically and optically very important because Angola is the site of the Lobito Corridor, which is going to be, or is, the space where the United States and European Union are seeking to challenge on infrastructure development. So when we're talking about new infrastructure in Latin America and Africa by the Chinese, the Americans and Europeans are building some old infrastructure by refurbishing this 1,000-kilometer railway from the cobalt and copper mining belts in Zambia and the DRC to the port of Lobito on the Atlantic coast. Interesting that also in the report, they mentioned that these are going to be the areas where the U.S. and the Europeans compete directly with the Chinese in the new infrastructure priorities. So taking into account the great power rivalry aspect of all this, how the West is moving into some of the traditional infrastructure spaces that the Chinese once held, but at the same time, the Chinese are now moving into the services, the new technology areas that the U.S. has long dominated. How do you see that interaction and that intersection happening?
I think in a lot of ways, on both sides, this is quite a healthy development because it just increases the number of options to African countries and the amount of competition in these fields. One of the reasons why there were such kind of shenanigans behind the scenes in some of these big Chinese contracts was that there wasn't any real kind of credible competition to it. In some cases, there weren't very strong kind of counter offers at the same price point, at least. Now, I think there's more pressure on all of these different countries to directly compete, which will also be a competition in terms of price. And I think at the same time, the fact that China is bringing a whole set of other capabilities to areas where Europe and the US used to have relatively uncontested dominance, I think similarly kind of increases competition, increases options for African countries, increases the opportunities for African countries to really tailor the offer on the table to their specific needs. I think where it's going to be a challenge, I think is going to be for African policymakers to really, really hone in on exactly what they need. Rather than the general thing of like, oh, we need ICT networks, for example. It's like, we need these particular kinds of ICT networks, right down to the very specific details. I think like honing the articulation of African demand, I think is going to be a significant challenge. And, because behind that lies a lot of demand gauging and demand measuring, kind of where I think sometimes African countries can be a little bit behind on.
This has been one of the big problems in the Africa-China relationship is the crafting of the feasibility studies and narrowing those demands to tailor what the Chinese are willing to offer right now. Over and over again, we've seen African governments approach the Chinese with projects that were either not fully baked out, not fully thought out, and not necessarily aligned with Chinese priorities. So, for example, when William Ruto, 4 months ago, went to Beijing, his deputy president was talking about him getting $1 billion for road construction. And again, that's not part of these new technologies. And we've heard from China Exim Bank insiders who've said they are so frustrated with African stakeholders who bring them half-baked project ideas that are not well thought through. They don't have a clear path to ROI. So I think the setting of the expectations and narrowing of the feasibility studies to deliver to Chinese financiers is going to be critically important. But again, Cobus, we come back to this, and I sound like a broken record on this show about the levels of China literacy among African policymakers in the presidential and prime minister's offices doesn't seem to be very high, and they're not reading reports like this one from the IAD, which they should. What is it going to take, do you think, to get African stakeholders, and not just in Africa, this is a problem in many other parts of the world as well, so I don't want to pick on Africa particularly, but China's changing very fast. And I'm not entirely convinced that a lot of people are keeping up.
You know, I agree with you. I mean, I have a certain amount of sympathy for the Africans and other global South governments in the sense that they, you know, despite the fact that China's changing and that China is now interested in funding other things, in a lot of cases, these countries still need the same things they needed before, right? Kind of like if one is interested in increasing trade and exports, for example, and you don't happen to not have a road between the harbor and your manufacturing area or your agricultural zones in your country, then that remains a problem. You know, kind of whether China was willing to build that road and now isn't, the demand, that doesn't change the demand. At the same time, I think it would help everyone, you know, kind of if these countries develop a higher awareness or a keener awareness of exactly not only what China is willing to fund, but also where exactly China's strengths lie and how one can balance, you know, kind of the strengths and weaknesses like offered by the Chinese system and kind of balance them out, right? Kind of by pulling in other, you know, kind of other areas. The classic example now is, and this is happening more and more, like African governments outsourcing environmental and other forms of monitoring and implementation to European monitoring agencies, for example, and then having the contracting done by the Chinese. That is an example of a kind of a way of hedging one's risks or hedging one's bets in order to make sure that you get the strongest offered by the different players. But I think one needs a lot more of that in Africa. And with that comes a much stronger, I think, a stronger kind of awareness of what oneself needs, right? Kind of like what kind of investments are really going to pay off? What kind of investments are really going to bring you over that kind of developmental hump? In comparison to which kinds of investments are just nice to have or are just the kind of things that countries like you need. You know, so there lies the rub. Like, what do countries like you need versus what do your country specifically need?
Fair enough. And I also don't want to leave the impression that we're, again, in any way picking on African governments about their lack of China literacy, because you wrote a column last week that highlighted that none other than U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also could really benefit enormously from a subscription to the China Global South Project. I mean, my goodness. He was speaking about the Chinese. And again, he's now using the same coded language that the Chinese oftentimes refer to the U.S. So they don't mention each other by name, but they're doing a lot of wink, wink, nod, nod. You know what I'm talking about? And he referenced the Chinese. And what was remarkable that you noticed in the column was how his rhetoric about the Chinese in 2024 was eerily similar to his predecessor Hillary Clinton in, I think, 2011, and has not changed at all in the 13 intervening years.
I tend to not think of the U.S. Secretary of State's those kind of repeated talking points, because as we showed, as you mentioned, we showed those talking points going back to the Clinton days. And keep in mind, I mean, Hillary Clinton was using these talking points before the Belt and Road Initiative was coined. So we're talking pre-BRI talking points. And they are repeated right through the 2010s by Democrats and Republicans, you know, up to Secretary Blinken like last week. Okay, so these essentially, it's accusing China of predatory lending, of debt trap diplomacy, of importing workers, and of bad environmental implementation, or more specifically, worse than other foreign kind of contractors' level of environmental implementation. So those issues have all been debunked. To the extent they've debunked so conclusively that repeating them now, like I argued, is a kind of boils down to a form of disinformation, simply because there's a lot of problems in the Africa-China relationship, but these problems that they're pointing out are not real, or they haven't been real in the last few years anyway. But to my mind, this is not an example of ignorance. The State Department has incredible research capability. There's no way, I know from just speaking with State Department people that they know that these talking points are not real. I think they're just very politically convenient. I think they're a kind of a shorthand that I think, and it's not only American leaders. I've pointed out almost identical kind of talking points coming from European policymakers as well, frequently slipped in under the radar, kind of in a way where you kind of have to have followed this conversation to realize like, oh, this is a reference to China. And I think that's not by accident. I think this is a kind of a rhetoric. I think it's a kind of a rhetorical deployment, I think. It's a kind of a dog whistle, kind of to anti-China kind of audiences, particularly at home, I think. Like many of these points are aimed, I think, at Washington, and they're aimed at, and inside the Beltway, and they're aimed at also at Brussels when Europeans say that. So, so I think that is what's at play here. I don't think this is people not knowing what they're talking about.
You and I might disagree here because I live by the mantra, never assign conspiracy when mediocrity will do. And don't underestimate how the information from that great research capability within the State Department that you speak of just doesn't make it up to the Secretary's 7th floor office. That it's filtered so much, and that he's just not getting the information. He's not taking the time to update his data set. He's not reading about this stuff, and he just doesn't know. I mean, don't assume that necessarily it's some conspiracy. It's the mediocrity is certainly something that is a high probability in my view.
Sure, but that's also indicative, right? That's also revealing, because what that indicates is the low level of priority put on the Africa-US relationship, right? Because if one is, for example, going to Vietnam, then one would go with fresh talking points, right? You would think,
but again, how is it possible that the head of AFRICOM, the U.S. military commander for Africa, shows up in front of the Senate and House oversight committees and is spouting all sorts of, bad information? And then the Senate committees are sitting there going, yeah, I agree. Again, the prevalence and pervasiveness of mediocrity in Washington is breathtaking. And so it's not always conspiratorial in that respect.
Again, I don't see that necessarily as mediocrity. I think that's in-group communication. Like US stakeholders speaking to US stakeholders with quite kind of like vested interest in pushing certain talking points. So there, I don't think it's I think it's messaging. I think it's not mediocrity.
Okay, Cobus, let's leave the conversation there. There's obviously a lot more that we can dive into. This is a topic we've covered a lot in the past, and invariably we're going to pick it up again. But if you would like to continue the conversation online, go visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. You'll see just an amazing array of content from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, all about China's engagement. All of it independently produced, agenda-free. This kind of journalism, though, does need your support. It doesn't come free. We depend on our subscriptions from our readers. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. And you'll find some very affordable subscription options that are there. If you are a student or teacher, just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll send you the links for half-off rates of just $10 a month or $99 a year. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.